Think you know everything about food preservation. The Wild West had techniques so strange, so effective, and so forgotten that most people today have never heard of them. These weren't the common methods everyone knows. These were the secret tricks that separated survival from starvation. Some of these methods sound crazy, some sound disgusting, but they all worked and they kept frontier families fed through brutal conditions. Let's start with one of the weirdest preservation techniques you've never heard of. Burying eggs in wood ash. Yes, you read that right. Frontier families preserved fresh eggs for months by burying them in the ashes from their fireplaces and stoves. And it actually worked. Wood ash is highly alkaline with a pH around 10 to 12. This high alkalinity creates an environment where bacteria struggle to survive. The ash also draws moisture away from the eggs, keeping them dry and preventing spoilage. The process was simple but required attention to detail. You'd collect clean wood ash from your fireplace or stove, making sure it was completely cool. Hot ash would cook the eggs, which defeated the purpose. You'd fill a barrel, crock, or wooden box with a layer of ash about 2 inches deep. Then you'd nestle fresh eggs into the ash, making sure they didn't touch each other. Eggs touching could crack and spoil. You'd cover those eggs with more ash and add another layer of eggs. This continued until the container was full. A homesteader's diary from 1873 describes the process. After collecting eggs all week, I packed them into a barrel with wood ash from the stove. I made sure each egg was completely surrounded by ash and that none touched each other. The barrel was sealed and stored in the cellar. Eggs preserved this way could last for 6 months or more. When you wanted to use an egg, you dig it out of the ash, wash it thoroughly under water to remove all the ash and crack it open. The egg inside would be perfectly normal, though sometimes the white was slightly thinner than a fresh egg. The ash created a seal around each egg, preventing air from reaching the shell. It also absorbed any moisture that might have caused bacterial growth. The alkalinity prevented any bacteria that did make contact from multiplying. This method was especially popular in winter when chickens laid fewer eggs. Families would preserve eggs during the productive summer months and use them throughout winter when fresh eggs were scarce. The main challenge was keeping the ash completely dry. If moisture got into the ash, it would turn into a paste and the preservation would fail. Containers had to be sealed tightly and stored in dry locations like root cellars or pantries. While burying eggs in ash sounds strange, the next technique sounds downright medieval: storing meat in animal fat. This is essentially the French confit technique, but frontier settlers discovered it independently out of necessity. The principle is simple but effective. Fat creates an airtight seal that prevents bacteria from reaching the meat. As long as the meat is completely submerged in solid fat, it won't spoil. To preserve meat this way, you'd start by cooking it thoroughly. This killed any bacteria present in the raw meat. Then you'd pack the cooked meat tightly into a crock or jar. Next came the fat. You'd render lard from pork fat or tallow from beef fat, heating it until it was completely liquid. This melted fat would be poured over the cooked meat while still hot, filling every gap and air pocket. A ranch wife's cookbook from 1879 describes the process. After butchering, I cook the pork thoroughly in the oven. I pack the cooked meat into crocks, pressing it down firmly. I render the fat and pour it over the meat while still hot, making sure the meat is completely covered by at least an inch of fat. As the fat cooled, it would solidify into a hard, protective layer. This layer prevented air from reaching the meat and created a barrier against bacteria. Meat preserved this way could last for months. Some families would preserve an entire butchered hog this way in the fall and eat from it all winter. When you wanted to use the meat, you'd scrape away the fat layer, remove the amount of meat you needed, and then reseal the remaining meat with fresh melted fat. The fat itself could be reused for cooking, so nothing was wasted. The preserved meat tasted rich and fatty, which was actually desirable on the frontier where calories were precious. The fat had absorbed flavors from the meat, making it delicious for frying or baking. This method worked best with pork because pork fat has good flavor and solidifies at room temperature. Beef tallow could also be used, though it was harder and less pleasant to work with. The technique has been almost completely forgotten in modern America, though it's still used in French cooking for duck confit and other dishes. Frontier families didn't know they were making confit, they just knew it kept meat from spoiling. Another forgotten preservation method that sounds almost magical is storing food in honey. This ancient technique was used on the frontier when honey was available, and it worked remarkably well. Honey is a natural preservative. Its high sugar content and low moisture create an environment where bacteria cannot survive. Food stored in honey can last indefinitely, literally for years or even decades. The method was beautifully simple. Take whatever you wanted to preserve, usually fruit but occasionally small pieces of cooked meat, and place it in a container. Pour honey over it until the food is completely submerged. Make sure no part of the food is exposed to air. Seal the container and store it in a cool, dark place. A homesteader's diary from 1868 describes preserving wild berries. We found a patch of wild strawberries and picked more. Then we could eat. I placed the berries in a crock and poured honey over them until they were completely covered. The honey was expensive, but I knew it would preserve them perfectly. The honey not only preserved the food, but also flavored it intensely. Fruits stored in honey became almost candied, incredibly sweet and rich. The fruit would absorb some of the honey while the honey absorbed the fruit's flavor, creating a delicious syrup. The science behind honey preservation is fascinating. Honey has a pH of around 3.9, making it acidic enough to inhibit bacterial growth. It also contains hydrogen peroxide, which has natural antibacterial properties, and its extremely low water content means bacteria can't get the moisture they need to multiply. Ancient Egyptians used honey to preserve bodies for burial. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that's still perfectly edible. That same preservative power worked for food. The main limitation was cost. Honey was precious on the frontier. You had to either keep bees, which required knowledge and equipment, or trade for honey, which was expensive. Most families used honey preservation sparingly, saving it for special fruits or small quantities of precious foods. Some families would preserve small amounts of cooked meat in honey, especially game birds or choice cuts. The honey would keep the meat from spoiling and add a sweet glaze when it was later cooked. Now let's talk about one of the most fascinating and forgotten foods of the Wild West, pemmican. Most people today have never heard of it, but it was the ultimate survival food, capable of keeping a person alive indefinitely. Pemmican was invented by Native Americans and adopted by fur trappers, explorers, and some cowboys who learned its incredible value. It was a concentrated mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. Making pemmican was labor-intensive but created food that could last for years without spoiling. The process started with drying meat completely, usually buffalo, deer, or elk. The meat would be sliced thin and dried in the sun or over smoke until it was brittle and hard as wood. Once the meat was bone dry, the real work began. You'd pound the dried meat into a fine powder using rocks, a mortar and pestle, or whatever tools you had. This took hours of exhausting work, reducing strips of dried meat into a consistency almost like flour. A fur trapper's journal from 1843 describes making pemmican. We dried buffalo meat for 5 days until it was completely desiccated. Then we spent an entire afternoon pounding it into powder. My arms ached for days, but we produced 20 pounds of meat powder that would keep us alive through the winter. Next came the fat. You'd render fat from the same animal, heating it slowly until it melted into pure liquid. This rendered fat was crucial because fat provides concentrated calories. and doesn't spoil the way meat does. The powdered meat and melted fat would be mixed together in roughly equal proportions. Some recipes added dried berries, usually choke cherries, blueberries, or cranberries. The berries added flavor, sweetness, and vitamin C. The mixture would be packed tightly into leather bags or sewn into animal intestines and sealed. As it cooled, it would solidify into a dense, greasy block that was incredibly calorie-rich. Pemmican was remarkably stable. It didn't freeze solid in winter, it didn't melt in summer heat, it didn't rot, mold, or spoil. A bag of pemmican made in 1850 would still be perfectly edible in 1860. The taste was intense and not for everyone. A cowboy's memoir from 1876 describes it as greasy, chewy, and tasting strongly of whatever animal it came from. With a slight sweetness from the berries, not pleasant, but after days without food, it was salvation. Pemmican provided complete nutrition. The dried meat supplied protein and minerals. The fat provided energy and calories. The berries added vitamins, especially vitamin C, which prevented scurvy. Explorers crossing the Arctic relied on pemmican. Fur trappers spent entire winters eating little else. A man could survive indefinitely on pemmican alone, and many did during long expeditions or harsh winters. The preservation worked because of the complete removal of moisture combined with the protective coating of fat. Bacteria need moisture to grow. Without it, they can't survive. The fat created a barrier that kept air and moisture out. Today, pemmican is almost completely forgotten except among historical reenactors and extreme survivalists. But for decades, it was the most important survival food on the frontier. Another forgotten technique was storing grain in ash. This wasn't just any grain storage, this was a specific method that used wood ash to protect flour and cornmeal from insects and moisture. Weevils, moths, and other insects were constant problems for stored grain. They'd lay eggs in flour or cornmeal, and soon you'd have an infestation. Moisture would cause grain to mold. Ash solved both problems. The method was simple. You'd layer grain and ash in a barrel or crock, a layer of grain, then a thin layer of ash, then more grain, then more ash. The ash created barriers that insects couldn't cross and absorbed any moisture. A homesteader's guide from 1875 describes the technique. Store flour in barrels with layers of clean wood ash between each layer of flour. The ash will keep insects out and prevent the flour from becoming damp and moldy. When you needed flour, you'd scoop it out and sift it to remove the ash. The ash didn't affect the flour's taste or baking properties as long as it was sifted out properly. Burying food underground in pits was another forgotten technique that used the Earth's natural temperature regulation. Underground temperatures remain relatively constant year-round, providing natural refrigeration. Cowboys and settlers would dig pits about 3 to 4 feet deep. They'd line these pits with straw, leaves, or grass to provide insulation and keep food from direct contact with dirt. A settler's account from Kansas in 1871 describes his underground storage. I dug a pit 4 feet deep and lined it with prairie grass. I placed our potatoes, turnips, and carrots inside, covered them with more grass, and filled the pit with dirt. All winter, we dug down and retrieved vegetables as needed. They stayed fresh despite the freezing temperatures above ground. This method worked best for root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets. These vegetables naturally store well and benefit from the cool, humid environment underground. The underground storage had to be well drained. If water pooled in the pit, everything would rot. Smart settlers chose high ground or sloped areas where water would drain naturally. Retrieving food in winter was challenging. You had to dig through frozen ground to reach your vegetables, but it was worth the effort to have fresh food in the middle of winter. Another forgotten method was storing butter in brine. Butter was precious on the frontier, and keeping it fresh without refrigeration was challenging. Brine preservation solved this problem. To preserve butter in brine, you'd pack fresh butter tightly into a crock, pressing out all air pockets. Then you'd cover it completely with a strong salt brine, similar to the brine used for pickling. The salt brine created a barrier that prevented air from reaching the butter and stopped bacterial growth. Butter preserved this way could last for months. A dairy farmer's manual from 1877 describes the process. Pack fresh butter into crocks, pressing it down firmly. Make a brine with 1 cup of salt to 4 cups of water. Pour the brine over the butter until it's completely covered. Store in a cool place. When you wanted to use the butter, you'd scoop out what you needed and rinse it thoroughly to remove the salt. The butter would be saltier than fresh butter, but it was perfectly usable for cooking and baking. One of the strangest forgotten preservation methods was using water glass, also called sodium silicate. This was a chemical solution that created an airtight seal around eggs, preserving them for up to a year. Water glass was a thick, syrupy liquid that could be purchased from general stores or pharmacies to preserve eggs. You'd place fresh eggs in a crock and pour water glass solution over them until they were completely submerged. The water glass would seal the pores in the eggshells, preventing air and bacteria from entering. Eggs preserved this way remained fresh for many months. A homemaker's guide from 1892 describes the method. Place fresh eggs in a crock. Mix 1 part water glass with 10 parts boiled water. Pour the solution over the eggs until they're covered by at least 2 inches. Store in a cool place. This method was more effective than ash preservation and became popular in the late 1800s. However, it required purchasing water glass, which wasn't always available in remote areas. Today, almost no one has heard of water glass egg preservation. It's been completely replaced by refrigeration. Making fruit leather was another forgotten technique. This concentrated dried fruit could last for months and provided intense sweetness and nutrition. To make fruit leather, you'd cook fruit until it was very soft and mashable. Then you'd mash it into a smooth puree, removing any seeds or skins. This puree would be spread thinly on flat surfaces, usually wooden boards, or cloth stretched on frames. The puree would be left in the sun to dry for several days. As it dried, it would transform from a wet puree into a leathery sheet that could be peeled off and rolled up. A homesteader's account from 1874 describes making apple leather. We had more apples than we could use. I cooked them until soft, mashed them smooth, and spread the puree on boards. After 4 days in the hot sun, the puree had dried into sheets that I rolled up and stored in jars. Fruit leather lasted for months and provided a sweet treat during winter. It could be eaten as is or rehydrated by soaking in water. The concentrated fruit flavor was intense and delicious. Any fruit could be made into leather: apples, peaches, plums, berries, even wild fruits. The process was the same regardless of the fruit. Storing vegetables in sand was another forgotten method. Root vegetables like carrots, beets, and turnips could be layered in dry sand and would stay fresh for months. The sand had to be completely dry. Moist sand would cause the vegetables to rot. You'd fill a box or barrel with a layer of sand, place vegetables on top, making sure they didn't touch, cover with more sand, and repeat. The sand prevented the vegetables from touching each other, which would cause them to rot. It also absorbed any moisture the vegetables released and provided insulation against temperature changes. A root cellar manual from 1881 describes the technique. Layer carrots in boxes of dry sand. Make sure no carrots touch each other. Store in a cool, dry place. The carrots will remain crisp and fresh for months. This method worked better than simply piling vegetables in a root cellar because the sand prevented rot from spreading from one vegetable to another. Making sweet pickles with vinegar and sugar syrup was another forgotten preservation method. This was different from regular pickling because the sugar syrup added sweetness and additional preservation. You'd pack vegetables or fruits into jars and cover them with a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices. The combination of acid from the vinegar and sugar created a hostile environment for bacteria. A recipe from 1878 describes sweet pickled peaches. Pack peach halves into jars, make a syrup with equal parts vinegar and sugar, adding cinnamon and cloves, pour the hot syrup over the peaches and seal the jars. Sweet pickles could last for a year or more. They were a special treat, combining preservation with delicious flavor. Making head cheese was a forgotten technique for using every part of a butchered animal. This wasn't cheese at all, but a jellied meat product made from the head and other scraps of a pig or calf. The head would be boiled for hours until all the meat fell off the bones. This meat would be chopped fine and mixed with the gelatinous cooking liquid. The mixture would be poured into molds and allowed to cool and set. The natural gelatin from the bones and connective tissue would cause the mixture to solidify into a firm, sliceable product. Head cheese could be stored in a cool place for weeks. A butcher's manual from 1876 describes the process. Boil the pig's head with the feet and hocks until the meat is falling off. Remove the bones and chop the meat fine. Season with salt, pepper, and sage. Pour into molds and let set. Head cheese was a way to waste nothing from a butchered animal. Today, it's almost completely forgotten, except in some traditional communities. Storing apples in straw was a simple but effective forgotten technique. Apples would be individually wrapped in straw or hay and layered in barrels or boxes. The straw prevented the apples from touching each other, which would cause them to rot. It also absorbed moisture and provided cushioning during storage and transport. A fruit grower's guide from 1880 describes the method. Wrap each apple individually in clean straw, layer them in barrels with straw between each layer, store in a cool, dry place. The apples will keep for months. This method allowed families to enjoy apples well into winter, long after the harvest was over. Clabbered milk was a forgotten preservation technique that involved controlled souring. Fresh milk would be left at room temperature until it naturally soured and thickened. This wasn't spoiled milk. It was deliberately cultured milk similar to yogurt or buttermilk. The natural bacteria in the milk would ferment the lactose, producing lactic acid. This acid preserved the milk and created a tangy, thick product that could last for weeks. A dairy manual from 1873 describes clabbered milk. Leave fresh milk in a warm place for 1 to 2 days. It will thicken and develop a pleasant sour taste. This clabbered milk can be used for drinking, baking, or making cheese. Clabbered milk was safer than fresh milk because the acidity killed harmful bacteria. It was also more digestible for people who had trouble with fresh milk. Finally, parching corn was a Native American technique adopted by some frontier settlers. Corn kernels would be dry roasted until they were hard and crunchy. This removed moisture and created a shelf-stable food. Parched corn could be eaten as is, like a crunchy snack, or ground into flour. It could also be rehydrated by soaking in water. A settler's account from 1870 describes parching corn. We roasted corn kernels in a dry skillet until they were brown and hard. This parched corn lasted for months and could be eaten as a snack or ground into meal for cooking. Parched corn was lightweight and portable, making it perfect for travel. Native Americans had used this technique for centuries, and some frontier families learned it from them. These 15 forgotten preservation techniques kept the Wild West fed through conditions we can barely imagine today, from burying eggs in ash to making pemmican, from storing meat in fat to preserving in honey. Frontier families used every trick available to survive.